Good morning, everybody. I'm not much of a podium person, so I'll be kind of circling around, but it is honestly a true honor to be here. As Judge Bear said, I grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, learned to ski at Seven Springs, so this is quite a homecoming. But I do live in Colorado now, where the mountains are a little taller, but it's still so beautiful to be back here. I am so excited about today. When Sandy asked me to come, I am thrilled. Because as you will, I hope, see and convey, my passion is working with people who have survived trauma. And my goal for you today is we're gonna shake it up a bit today. In the 2.5 hours or so that we get to spend together, we are gonna shake it up. Because for so long, psychologists and social workers and all of us in this field, and perhaps you all, have thought about trauma as a psychological response to something bad that happens. But actually, what we're learning and what the latest research is saying is that psychological trauma is not psychological. It's actually a neurological, a neurobiological response to neurobiological injury that happens in the brain. It's a really different way of thinking about things. And my goal for us today is for you to understand what that is. So we're going to go back to Biology 101. We're going to look at brain science, but in a way, I promise, that you will understand. And then understand how people react and why they react the way they do to trauma in behaviors that can kind of have us scratching our head or have us missing. We'll understand that in a different way. And then we'll also understand our responses, because in doing the work that we all do in this room and listening to cases and being guardian ad litem cases and sitting on the bench in these cases, we also experience that secondary trauma. Well, guess what? Our brains are doing the same things that the victims' brains are doing. It has the same impact. So once we understand that, then we'll move to how do we actually provide best services to victims so that healing is possible. And we can talk about evidence-based practices and that kind of treatment, and that is fantastic. We'll talk about that. But I also want to talk about things that also address the neurobiological re-regulation. Okay? So we have a lot to do. So I'm going to come down. I like to move around. If for some reason you can't hear me or see me, let me know. But I like to come down and meet you all. And also, the great technical people have set up microphones around the room. You can kind of see them. There's one here, one in the back, and one over there. I like a lot of questions. As a matter of fact, as we go through here, we're going to be talking about brain stuff. We're going to be talking about stuff that we don't usually talk about. So I would expect questions, okay? And I'm fine with that because we have a good amount of time today to really dig in. So here we go. Let's get going. So the way I like to look at trauma is on a continuum of stress, right? From normal to situational to what we call traumatic stress. Now, does anybody in here have stress? Sandy, you sent me to the wrong room. No, nobody in here has stress, right? So just, what are some examples of normal stressful things we deal with all the time? Just yell it out. Bills, very good. Bills, finances. What else? Traffic, kids, relationships, right? Even if they're good, they're stressful. Tuition. Oh, I hear you, right? So normal stress are usually things we can deal with if we have good coping, we figure out how to manage it, we get support, and we figure it out. If we're functional, we manage most stress. Now, situational stress is the stress gets a little more intense. The acuity goes up, the intensity goes up. But here's the thing, we also know it's going to end. It's not going to last forever. It's not going to be that intense forever. What are some examples of situational stress? Sir?
Permanency hearings.
Permanency hearings, exactly. intense cases, intense hearings, right, that you're going through. They're hard, but you also know they're going to end. They're not going to go on forever, right? Hopefully. Right. Right, hardly ever. What else? So situational stress. Yeah, exactly. Weddings, holidays, moving, deadlines, right? Okay, teenagers, because you know they're going to, like, hit 19 or 20 at some point. Yeah, exactly. Now, typically, again, the stress gets a little more acute. This is often the time people seek extra support. This is the time people might seek counseling or go to their colleagues or to their friends, right? But again, maybe sleep gets disrupted here, diet gets off, you get out of your exercise regimen, but usually, you know, you kind of get back. You get it back. Now, traumatic stress, whole different ballgame. What's an example of a trauma? Certain kinds of death. Fire, things like, or disasters, right? Different kind of disasters, floods, hurricanes, blizzards, right? Could be. What else? Violent crime. So, interpersonal violence, sexual assault, sexual abuse, neglect, stalking, what else? Bullying, interpersonal violence in that way. Okay, other examples.
Illness.
Certain kind of illness, right, where certain kinds of illness. We'll talk about that. I heard something else. Accidents. So here's my question to you. What puts things in those categories that aren't in the normal or situational stress? Why is it traumatic? Why is it in that category? So it's unexpected, although you could have unexpected things happen, like an end of a relationship or a certain case goes down the tubes for certain reasons, right? It's not necessarily the hallmark of trauma. What puts it in that category? You have to learn to live with it. That's right. People don't necessarily get over trauma, right? It doesn't really go away. But there's a couple other hallmarks of trauma that makes it different. What's that? Severity. It's certainly more acute. Judith Herman, in her book Trauma and Recovery, talks about trauma overwhelming the senses, right? It's kind of an overwhelming experience. But there's something else. There's some other hallmarks of what makes put something in that category. Life-changing for sure, but why? Here's the thing. The hallmark of trauma, and this is important, is when there is a real or perceived threat to somebody's life or bodily integrity. Okay? It's when someone feels that they're going to be harmed in a way that could take their life, but at the very least is going to harm them physically, harm them emotionally, right? Or their sense of their body being safe. I mean, what Kathy shared this morning is pretty impactful. That, for example, that goes beyond just regular fear. She had an incident where her physical safety was compromised to the point, I mean, luckily, you survived that. But I'm sure if we asked Kathy at some point, we would say, what did you think was going to happen? And she could have said, I could have died, right? That was like one step away from that. So here's the thing. When that happens, y'all, sometimes I went to grad school at the University of Tennessee, and sometimes when I get going, for some reason the y'alls slip out. I'm not exactly sure why. I don't know where that comes from, but anyway, they do. So when that happens, trauma, it's a trauma response, perhaps. So when those life-threatening or perceived life-threatening abuse, neglect things happen in that category, something different happens in the brain than happens in these other circumstances. And it leads to responses that aren't kind of typical or what we would see as normal responses, and we'll dig into that. I want you to take a second. Where's my pointer here? I think is this it? Yeah. Thought it was there. Is it there? Oh, not strong enough to go that far. Okay, we'll do our best. Take a look at that picture if you can see it. Anybody know where that picture was taken from? Nope. Yep, I heard it. 9/11, September 11th, 2001. And if you can see, it might be kind of hard in the back, but if you can see the faces of those people, if you had to give it an emotion of what they were feeling, what would you say it was? Shock, horror, and terror. Think about those words for a minute. Shock, horror, and terror. Notice nobody said upset or worried, okay? Shock, horror, and terror are kind of those feelings on steroids, right? It's a completely different level of feeling. That is the hallmark of trauma, shock, horror, and terror. And even though you might work with a kid or a child that comes into your system, and the child necessarily doesn't look that way, doesn't look shocked or horrified or terrified, at some point in the trauma, either they looked like this or they felt like this. And what's important to know is that if we put PET scans on these people's brains, PET scans are positron emission topography scans. They literally measure brain activity. They measure what part of the brain are activated, what part is stimulated under certain circumstances, okay? That's what a PET scan is. If we put PET scans on these people's brains, we would see some major league different things happening than if we put them on yours right now. You know, even if you are just having some normal stress, it would be very, very different. And that's what I'm going to tell you about, because that's what causes change in behavior. Now, look, two of these people actually have their hands over their mouths. What do you think, what is that? What's that about? Keep from throwing up. I mean, trauma has a level of kind of disgust to it, of nauseating kind of upsetness, right? But it's interesting. Again, if you haven't read a book in this area, a book called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman is a must-read. Came out in 1992, so at this point it's kind of old, but it's still really one of the seminal works. And Dr. Herman talks about trauma being a dialectical between wanting to speak about something and not wanting to tell it. So it's a tension between, and think about putting a hand over the mouth is almost, it's unspeakable. What I'm seeing is unspeakable. And that is the essence of trauma. And that is why so often people don't talk about traumatic things that happen to them. There's a desire to tell about it and a desire to forget it and let it go. And that's why sometimes it can be, I think there's such a myth, right, that when something terrible happens to a kid or an adolescent or an adult, the first thing they're going to do is tell someone. When actually, the more typical response is they don't tell anybody. And when they do start telling, the story comes out slowly over time, and details come out slowly over time. It's not a rush to, this is what happened to me, and this was everything I saw. Some of it is unspeakable. So we identified a lot of lists of these traumas, right? And notice the last bullet point. Witnessing or hearing any of the above. So my question to this group, 350 of you lovely people, take a look at that list and think of your last month at work. How many of you have heard or read stories about any of those above? Raise your hand. Okay, you know what that means? Those of us in our room, our brains are having the same kind of change that those people's brains are undergoing there. So it means we're all impacted by this work too. We might think, well, I didn't go through it directly. It didn't happen to me directly. I just read this case report, or I just sat on the bench, right? If you're hearing these details and you know this, your brain's processing this in a completely different way, right, than if you were hearing maybe traffic cases. So keep that in mind. We'll understand that. Always have to understand that culture and gender differences will always influence how trauma is both perceived and expressed. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean? Let me give you an example. So we're here in this lovely resort, Seven Springs, Pennsylvania. Let's say we were in here, where I was given this training, and right outside where the cars are parked, all of a sudden some car bombs started going off. 5 or 6 or 7 car bombs just start going off. Honestly, what do you think we would do in here? Panic, run out, take cover. You know I would be long gone, hitting it, running anywhere. Do you think we'd resume this training? We'd be like, no, we're done. We're so done for the day. We're not, what's that?
I said we'd need this training.
We would need this training, right, but we wouldn't probably want to come sit in this room and do it. Now, what if we were all in Islamabad, Pakistan? You know where I'm going. And some car bombs went off. I mean, we might notice it, you know. We might get up to see if it's our car out there and, check it out. But would we continue the training? Probably. I mean, we'd probably check to see if there were people injured, if there was threat, but we'd probably come back. We might take a break, but we'd probably come back. It just shows when you live with a certain level of violence and what we would perceive as trauma. If it happened here, I would perceive that as a traumatic event. But where trauma happens all the time, where violence happens all the time, someone may not even perceive it as a trauma or have the expressed, symptoms related to that. Now, that's a very dramatic example, but let's bring it home to your work. You work with kids, some of the worst cases in the system, where you're having to decide to remove kids or not, right? And you're working with a kid, there's horrendous violence and abuse or neglect in the home, and the kid might not even perceive it as such, because that is what that family system is. That's what that kid knows. Perhaps they've grown up with a history where there's been domestic violence or alcoholism in the house or other kinds of abuse in the house the whole time. And then there's a sexual abuse incident or something that, some horrendous neglect. And the kid comes out and you're like, and the kid isn't even perceiving it as such because that is their culture. Does that make sense? So we might see it as, oh my goodness, this is a horrendous trauma and blah, 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 blah. And then the kid might not be even manifesting any symptoms of trauma just yet. But that doesn't mean that that kid's brain isn't pretty seriously impacted and that symptoms won't start to develop at some point. Any questions so far? Please don't hesitate. Raise your hand, jump up. Okay. Again, I also want us to keep in mind this issue called historical trauma. We don't think about this. We don't think about this enough. Does anybody know what I mean by historical trauma? Historical trauma is the kind of regular and systematic forms of oppression that some cultural or racial groups have experienced in our country that are traumatic. For example, this picture was taken on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, not too far from Colorado. Native American people, where there was a intentional and systematic effort of genocide of a group of people, okay? Or Jewish people in internment camps, or African American people in slavery. This kind of trauma is generational, and what we know now about the brain is it's transmitted through the DNA in terms of how someone responds to stress. So it could be a factor in there for particular cultural groups whose generations have experienced this. And again, How many of the families that you have worked with or you see, you're not dealing with, well, there was one abusive incident that happened. Usually, perhaps, mom was a victim of domestic violence and her mother was an incest survivor, right? It can go generations sometimes in families. And you're like, well, why is this important? It's important because trauma has a neurobiological cellular DNA basis. So that means just as we inherit other things, right? You go to your PCP, and the first thing they start asking you is what? When you go to a new doctor, they start gathering history. Do you have a history of high blood pressure, of diabetes, right? Of cancer in your family? Well, guess what? They ask that. Why? Because they know you could be at risk if you have this in your family. Well, trauma is the same thing. If there is generations or historical trauma in your family, in your DNA, guess what? That means as the brain, as genetics are passed down, the brain is more susceptible to that kind of dysregulation if trauma's been present in other generations. So we have to look at that because that means the more severely the brain is impacted when there's a traumatic event. I'll talk more, you'll understand more when we get into the biology of it all. So take a look at this list. This is what we call trauma symptoms as adaptations. And take a look at this. And think about the clients that you work with who are using substances or acting out in some way, cutting themselves, dissociating, continuing to have contact with the same people even if they abuse them, being frozen or avoidant, engaging in eating disorders or other high-risk behaviors like criminal activity. How many of you have worked with clients that exhibit any of these symptoms? Okay. So what these are, you can look at these and we can sometimes get frustrated by these symptoms and think of clients as, well, they're acting out or they're doing everything to avoid. We use that term a lot with kids particularly. They're acting out. Well, why? And trauma-informed care would say, these are adaptations of the trauma, of the original trauma. In other words, the kid is often trying to find solutions to rebalance brain chemistry as a way to feel better. And guess what? All these things on this list rebalance brain chemistry. They all work. They are all very effective means to heal the brain and re-regulate the brain system. They all work. Now, of course, the problem is that all of them have long-term severe consequences and actually serve to dysregulate the brain in a more intense way the more they're used. So we have to think of these symptoms as adaptations to the trauma, and really it's the kids, it's the adults, it's the adolescents trying to solve a problem because they know something's off in the way they're feeling, in the way they're acting because of the imbalance of brain chemistry. And again, I'd encourage us, this is a challenge to us in the room, myself included, because we can get pretty pejorative when clients start doing these things. We can use names that aren't very good. Whoops. Like, this happens more with adults, but oh, she's a borderline. Or she's just a cutter. Or he's a drunk. We use these terms all the time that can have a pejorative flavor when really what someone's doing is trying to adapt to a trauma. And what our goal is, and what treatment's goal is give people other ways to re-regulate the brain chemistry that work, that aren't these things. Okay, any questions? So get ready, because we're gonna start now talking about the brain and what happens in the brain. And first of all, again, like I started, we have to understand that trauma is not purely a psychological issue. We've been wrong. We have been wrong all these years. It's a neurobiological issue. And the past becomes present because of the way that the brain dysregulates and changes after traumatic events. Have you heard somebody say, well, that happened 10 years ago. Why do I still feel upset about this? Well, and we know people don't get over trauma, but why? I'll show you. It's what happens in the brain, how the past, even if it was 30 years ago. You know, Kathy, even when, how long ago was that dog attack? 2009. Okay, so one might say, well, why are you scared of dogs now? It's been a while, right? You've had other positive experiences with dogs, right? So why are you so scared now? Well, it's not just Kathy psychologically, and she's psychologically weak. It's because when Kathy sees a dog, something happens in her brain, right, that is going to just remind her, it's going to bring back that traumatic incident as if it was happening now. And it doesn't matter if that dog's wagging and licking and is totally friendly. It's not going to matter. And I'll show you why. Here's the thing. I want to talk about the brain for a second. We used to think that the brain was this organ that just was an organ that grew and didn't change. It just was what it was. But now, honestly, in about the past 10 years, only 10 years, the science is that young, we're learning about something called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity essentially says that the brain can change, and it changes and adapts constantly based on one thing: experience. So if somebody has bad experiences and a series of bad experiences, the brain will change based on that. If someone has good experiences, the brain will change for the better. It changes. And why is that? Because what fires together in the brain wires together. So if the brain, and what I mean by that is the neurons that fire together wire together. So if bad experiences happen, neurons are going to fire in the brain and then wire around bad experiences, and then what do you have? You have a traumatized brain. Particularly if this is happening younger kids and often. I mean, how many of you deal with clients that have just one trauma? You know, it's usually multiple or repeated. Well, what's that mean? That means the brain has fired around bad experiences and it's wired. That equals traumatized brain. And then the way I see that is trauma echoes in the brain, if you will, and the whole goal of treatment needs to quiet that reverberation of that echo. I'll show you how. And then here's my thing, y'all. So I was trained very traditionally as a traditional psychologist. So I believe in psychotherapy. I believe in evidence-based practices like trauma-focused CBT and, EMDR, all these practices of therapy that we refer our kids or families to. I believe it. And I'm here to tell you that if that's all we do in terms of treatment and treatment choices, we're going to be about 25% effective in treating and mitigating trauma responses because it's physiological. And the best evidence-based practice is not going to address rewiring brain chemistry in the way it needs rewired. So I'm not saying don't do those practices. I'm saying absolutely do those practices to make sure they're the right ones. But they have to be supplemented in things that address the neurobiology. And I'm going to end by telling you a little bit about what those are and what the data and the outcome research is showing about how effective they are. Okay, we're going to go to Biology 101. You ready? Anybody need coffee? Okay, because this is really important foundational information here, right? So here's the thing. Everything everything we do and act and feel, everything we are, right now, you sitting in your chairs, turning your pages, taking your notes, it's a series of electrochemical responses through the brain. Stimulus comes in through the sensory thalamus, right? Anything we hear, see, taste, touch, feel comes through the brain. It activates the brain, and then chemical information is transmitted that causes us to act, to behave, to feel. That's done by these connecting of these neurons, right, in the brain. And really, what is critical is where one neuron connects to the other neuron. And that place where they connect is called what? The synapse, right here. Okay? I mean, let's just take a minute and appreciate the magnificence of this. What happens where one neuron connects to the other? This little area, this microscopic area called the synapse, is where chemical information exchanges, right, between the nerves. And if this gets thrown off, or if this is out of balance in some way, how we act and behave is thrown off, okay? Big time. And trauma completely disrupts what is going on here to the place where it's not normal, okay? So this is a blow up, right? A dramatization of this. So, sorry, I have to kind of stay here because my clicker will only work on one side. So I'll try to go back and forth. But so we have an electrical current coming through the brain, right? It activates these things called the presynaptic vesicles over here, which release neurotransmitters into the synapse. This is the synapse. And then they attach to the postsynaptic receptor, which then transmits the message throughout the body. So we act and behave. If you look at this synapse right here, this is a perfectly regulated neuron synapse right here. You have just the right amount of the presynaptic vesicles know how to release just the right amount of neurotransmitter in here. And these are chemical compounds that you've probably heard of. Things like serotonin, epinephrine, neuroepinephrine, GABA, dopamine. Okay, you've heard of all these chemical compounds. This is right here what looks like a regulated brain because it's in perfect balance. Keep this in mind. The brain likes a normal flow of information. Think about it. We don't like to be overwhelmed, and we don't like to be bored out of our minds, right? We like something where it's kind of, yeah, I feel a little challenged, I feel a little interested, but I'm not completely lost. So this is what the brain is, this would be the brain in kind of that ideal, optimal place, where the presynaptic vesicles know exactly what to release, and it releases the chemicals in just the right amount and balance and the right kind. Now, under trauma, here's what happens. You have an electrical current that comes in. Remember what we said. Shock, terror, horror, fear of life, fear of safety. You did all this stuff on safety yesterday, right? So think of the clients you work with who might have that experience of not feeling safe. This is what's going on in their brain. Electrical current comes in, it activates the presynaptic vesicles, and the presynaptic vesicles are like, whoa, hold on, sister, this is a lot. This is scary. This is scary information, this is scary experience, this is not normal stress. Under that condition, they start releasing, I mean, look at this synapse, y'all. There is a lot released into this synaptic area that either shouldn't be in there or is in there in the wrong amounts. So it's chemically completely imbalanced. And the brain says, whoa, this is too much. This is too scary. I'm going to do something called downregulate, which is the brain's way of turning down the volume, if you will. You know, think of your iPod. Think of how when it gets too loud, you turn it down. Well, that is what the brain is doing. It's turning down the volume so that this chemical information doesn't have a chance to attach. So how does it do that? It decreases the number of postsynaptic receptors on the receiving neuron. So that it says, okay, I'm going to kind of slow it down, soften it, quiet it. It's too much. So it's trying. Until you get to here. The next stage, called upregulation. So now this is post-trauma. Now you have an electrical current that comes in. It activates the presynaptic vesicles, and they are like confused. Think of them as they've been dysregulated. They've been damaged in some way because now they don't know what to release or in what amount. So then they, look at the synapse. There's not enough chemical information going on in here. There's just not enough stuff. So the brain says, okay, I need to try to adapt to this, so it starts creating more postsynaptic receptors here. Now, hold that thought before we go to the next slide. Take a look at this. What do you think somebody looks like when they're in this stage? When there is not enough chemical information even in the synaptic area? Dissociated? Right here, y'all, this is the essence of dissociation. What else? Have you had that you've worked with kids who look flat, right? Numb? This is actually a more common response, particularly in adults, but kids too, where someone looks just checked out, or they're talking about bad things that happen, but they don't have any emotion to it, right? This is what they look like neurobiologically. So the brain is trying to adapt again by adding more postsynaptic receptors here to try to attempt to maximize where this chemical information can attach until you get to here. Amplification, this is the nasty kind of stage in trauma. Because look what happens. Let's say you have a trigger event of the trauma. And what do I mean by a trigger event? What's a trigger, sir?
Something that reminds you of the scenario that led to your trauma.
That's exactly right. It's something that reminds someone, or it has some similarity, or it reminds them of that original trauma. Again, I'm going to go back to Kathy's. I hope you don't mind, because it's just a great example. So in Kathy's situation, what is it? It's dogs. No matter what the dog looks like or how it's acting, it's dogs. So for our kids who have been traumatized, this could be anything, right? This could be having to go talk about the case to the GAL. This could be having to testify in court. This could be, what else? Did you smell? A smell, a taste, a certain time of year, a certain place, like the school or the house or the neighborhood. All these are triggers. Even if they're good, they can be triggers. So look what happens. That information comes through the brain, sensory thalamus. It activates the presynaptic vesicles, which again have been damaged. They start releasing everything in the book. They start releasing everything they got into this synapse. And because of upregulation, right, that happened here, where more postsynaptic receptors were manufactured, there's all this place for this chemical information to connect to. So what does that mean? That means you have a triggered response that could look like what? Hypervigilance. It can look like flashbacks, nightmares. It can look like agitation, irritability. I mean, how many of the clients or kids you work, sometimes they're acting out in mean ways, right? Aggressive ways, aggression, rage. Guess what? That's this. That is this because of what is going on in this synaptic area and then all the places for it attached to. So think about it. You just have an amplified response. And here's the thing. Sometimes people can stay in this stage, right? They may not ever have this. Sometimes they'll go back and forth between feeling a little flat and numb to feeling super triggered. Okay, let me tell you something else. If somebody's in this stage, what do you think works to rebalance the brain back to this, which is this normal thing? What do you think works right here that'll restore that? What in particular? Uppers, you got it. Stimulants, right? Cocaine, nicotine. Guess what else? Power energy drinks. It will work. There's stimulants, okay? But drugs, you know, methamphetamine will balance this quicker than anything else. Now, the problems with all these is that they further dysregulate the presynaptic vesicles. So it works like for a while, and then over time, and not much time, the presynaptic vesicles get more screwed up, and there's more imbalance, and people have less ability to re-regulate. What works here? Look at this. In this amplified state, if you have somebody hypervigilant, rageful, on edge, what works here? Alcohol. 2 glasses of red wine, a 6-pack of beer will chill this system right out. It will. Think about us. We don't like to talk about us, right? But think about us for a minute. We're going through a horrendous permanency hearing, you know? Or, you know, out of home, and we heard these horrible stories. You know you have to make an intense decision. Guess what? Whether you want to believe it or not, your brain is doing some variation of this. So what do? We go to happy hour, right? Sometimes, some of us do, because it works. You know, 2 glasses of red wine, you're done, day's done, you can go, you're like a functional person, you're not going to go home and yell at your partner or whatever, you know, it works. But here's the amazing thing, and I'm going to talk about this after our break as we continue. What time? Yeah. There are other things. So red wine, okay, one of the things that gets out of whack in this synapse is a neurotransmitter called GABA, G-A-B-A. We'll talk more about it in a minute. Red wine really binds to GABA. 2 glasses of red wine, I mean, that's why we feel chilled out after a couple glasses of wine. It's because it binds to GABA. GABA gets rebalanced on our brain, and we feel good. Well, guess what else has the exact same neurobiological effect as GABA? Where's my judge who did that, who had a certain activity this morning? Yoga. Yoga, the outcomes of yoga have been found that 1 hour of a vigorous yoga practice, 1 hour, does the same thing to GABA as 2 glasses of red wine. I know. But here's the thing, I'm hearing a lot of chatter in here.
You haven't told us yet.
I haven't, because it's hard. It's so hard. I haven't sold it yet. I got another hour and a half. Maybe we'll get there. Okay. So here's the thing. But it's a culture shift. Look at the laughter. We have to go from going to happy hour after work to going to the yoga studio. And it's the same thing we need to do with the clients we serve. You know, it's like, I mean, we do things, or we'll do something, or we'll say, okay, go to therapy and talk about it. That's real good, but that is not going to re-regulate this. It's just not. It doesn't re-regulate it in ourselves. It won't re-regulate it to kids with a super traumatized brain. So we miss. So any questions around this before I go on, because this is hugely important foundationally. There got to be questions about this process, anything that you want to ask, or about how this is applicable, particularly to kids or families. There's a microphone, so please ask. You got it all?
No, I have a question.
Oh, good. think you're on.
Okay, it's on. I never took biology, so bear with me.
No, it's good.
What happens to the neurotransmitters? Do they, in time, go away, or they go back into the body? What happens to them? Once you get the up, what happens to
So
them?
that's a very good question. The question is like, I think it's like, what happens to this system? Is it always dysregulated in this way? And here's the answer. It's not a good answer. The answer is yes. They're always dysregulated in this way unless there is concentrated intentional effort to rebalance this. Otherwise, it won't, you know how trauma, we say we don't get over trauma? Well, some of it is not just psychological, it's neurobiological, because guess what? It doesn't go away. The system won't just go back on its own, okay? We have to do intentional stuff to re-regulate these neurons. And here's the thing, remember this. The more a neural system is activated, the more it will change. The earlier the trauma, the more chronic the trauma, the more profoundly this will change. So then, let's say you have a kid who's gone through horrendous abuse and neglect, and then that kid is 21 years old and they're sexually assaulted. You're going to be looking at a pretty intense neurobiological response because you already had such dysregulation happening in a forming brain. Because the brain, as we know it, isn't even developed until what? Age 25, 26 is what current research shows. So think about it. Kids who experience maltreatment, neglect, abuse, those neurons are forming in a developing brain. So the brain is developing around the trauma, right? So you don't have a lot of resiliency built up as opposed to, let's say somebody has no childhood trauma and then they experience something horrific like they're in a domestic violence relationship or they're sexually assaulted as an adult. Now that's not to say somebody won't have a trauma response, but their brain is going to be a lot more resilient to cope with that, right? Because it doesn't have such a dysregulated system that's happened for so long. Does that make sense? Any other questions, sir?
How do you explain, say, a family, microphone?
Oh yeah, microphone, right behind you there. Right there. It'd be good because this room is huge. Awesome.
How do you explain a situation, say, with a family, and I'm thinking of one particular family, 3 boys. Their mother died of cancer she was 40. They were 9, 10, early teens, in that range. And obviously what I would consider a trauma. On the other hand, of the 3 boys, 2 have turned into responsible, producing, productive adults. One boy has been in and out of juvenile institutions and jails, and really, at age 25, is probably still struggling in some form or another. Now, the exact same circumstance, when does trauma become an excuse? Where does maturity or getting beyond that trauma as a reason for behavior become, how do you get beyond the reason for my behavior to responsible behavior?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm so glad you asked. Hopefully you heard that. So here would be my response. You could have 3 kids, same situation, right? 2 of them kind of adjust. They don't exhibit any, at least, external manifestation. One does. Well, first of all, I might say, we don't know what else happened to that kid that might have been a different experience, childhood, that the other 3 didn't have. So his brain might have been impacted in a different way. These are a couple factors. Was he the youngest when that happened? I don't know. But his brain was still developing around the trauma in even a more primitive way. It's another factor. Secondly, what we know about resilience in trauma is one of the things is what kind of coping did the kids have? I don't know, obviously, this family, but say 2 of the kids, maybe one of them was really smart and the other one was really athletic. So maybe they had something that rewired their brain in a positive way. And maybe this third kid, maybe he wasn't very smart. He didn't have the peer support. He didn't have maybe sports or something. I'm just making this up. But these are all factors that could influence how quickly or how permanently a brain might rewire. So instead of seeing it as like, well, that's not an excuse, we have to see it as there was something about that kid's brain that didn't return to stabilization and neurocorrection in the way that the other two did. Now, that doesn't excuse bad behavior. We can't, trauma isn't, and this isn't about excusing bad behavior. He certainly needs to kind of work to change his life, right? And that is self-responsibility. But I think there's a piece of understanding that some of this may not be fully in his control neurobiologically based on factors that may not even be apparent to us. We might look at a case and say, all these kids went through the same thing. Well, maybe not. We don't necessarily know that. And again, the protective factors are that maybe the others had some protective factors neurobiologically that the other kid didn't, right? That allowed their brains to kind of heal and evolve better than this does. But again, I'm not about using that. Let me give you another example that I think really super illustrates this, and I think this crowd will be able to relate to this. How many of you have seen allegations of sexual abuse where one of the parents, let's say mom, knows the abuse is happening, hears about the abuse, and doesn't protect the kid from further abuse? Okay, that happens quite frequently, right? I see it a lot where this is particularly active where mom herself or dad or whoever has a history of their own trauma and goes into what's called a freeze response, or it could be in this response. So let's say a mom who already has a trauma history then finds out that dad or boyfriend is perping on their kid. Mom goes into this response, which is kind of dissociative, flat, numb, denial. Okay? This is what this looks like. So what happens? This isn't a point of where someone takes action, right? Now, I'm not excusing that mother for 1 minute. Parents have a right and a responsibility to protect children, and if they don't, they need to face consequences on that. So it's not an excuse, but it is an understanding. It's not just like mom is a complete loser and it could be that something is going on for mom, given her own trauma response or her own re-stimulation that she may not be able to act in what we would consider a normal way. So again, do you understand? I'm not saying that there shouldn't be consequences for that, or we should excuse that at all. I'm saying we understand it differently, and what that says is mom probably needs some big-time help on her own trauma to get back to the place of here where you have a quote-unquote normal response, which is child is in danger, protect child, act, right? Act, do, protect. Well, guess what? That's not what happens here. What happens here is deny, don't act, and stay frozen right here. Does that make sense? Does that help you kind of understand that in a different way? This is a big deal, and when a brain gets changed in this way, it's not really easy to change it back. They can't go to their caseworker, and the caseworker says, okay, you need to do this, this, and this. As we know, sometimes that doesn't happen, and it's because how profound this change is. So what we have to do is work with our clients, work with the people to get their brains re-regulated. Re-regulation. And I'm going to give you some tips on how to do that, okay? Great question. Anything else before, let's see, what time is it? A half hour before break, so we got time. I want to move on, but any other questions before we go? Ma'am. Awesome.
My question would be in regards to what you were speaking about with the unspeakable. And many of our children are coming into our systems with the unspeakable. So
That's
we're
right.
not aware of what their trauma details may be. We oftentimes address all children as if they've been traumatized to the worst that we can imagine. But some of those triggers, such as the perfumes, a different music station where they are living, we sometimes end up putting these children in trauma-triggered environments, even if we are removing them from their home into another home. So my question for you would be in regards to diagnoses. I can see where we might be, I don't know if it's a misdiagnosis, because when they're in this area, we're labeling them as depressed and flat affect, and we're treating them for depression. When they're in the next slide over, we're labeling them as ADHD, and they're bouncing all over the place, and so we're medicating them for that. So are we misdiagnosing whenever we're responding in that way? Or is that truly a secondary diagnosis that we should be treating?
I think that is a brilliant question, and it opened my belief in doing this work for almost 20 years. What I see is that, right, exactly, in this state, guess what a kid looks like in this state? They look distracted. They look unable to focus. They look irritable. They look impulsive, okay? All those get easily tagged with what diagnosis? ADHD, learning disabilities and ADHD. Now here's the thing. I think I've been doing a lot of, ADHD is a solid, reputable, appropriate diagnosis in some cases, but my belief is that it mirrors so much PTSD that we overdiagnose ADHD and we underdiagnose PTSD. We don't look for, again, we focus on what the kid is doing. Trauma-informed care would not ask what's wrong with you. Trauma-informed care asks what happened to you. And if we go into a diagnosis where we just look at what's wrong, the kid's acting out, aggressive, irritable, not focused, that is not a trauma-informed care diagnosis. And if I had a quarter for how many times I've seen an ADHD diagnosis when really it's PTSD, I would say it's about 80% of the time. And then y'all, it's not a benign mistake. It's not a benign mistake, because look at this synapse right here. What do you think happens? What do we medicate with ADHD? Stimulants. What do you think happens with this dysregulated brain when we give it stimulants? It's not good. It's not good. It can agitate and amplify the behavior even more. I have a slide that I'll show you later on that Richard Freeman in the New York Times talked about veterans coming back with PTSD and it not getting diagnosed accurately. It's getting diagnosed as ADHD. They're given stimulants, and the research is actually showing that that can actually serve to burn in the trauma memory more, because the stimulant create these neural pathways in a more agitated, inflated, intense way, and it burns in the trauma and actually makes the trauma much worse. Okay? This is a big deal. So the other thing, I'm going to show you, let's see. I'm going to show another slide that has to do with a brain structure called the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. Well, in trauma, the hippocampus actually shrinks, so that decreases learning capacity, particularly in kids. So again, kids get diagnosed with learning disabilities or ADD. And really what's causing that is an imbalance in cortisol that gets imbalanced in that synapse that shrinks the hippocampus. Okay? So I think, to your point, diagnosing is critical. And whoever you're referring to make the diagnosis in your courts and in your systems needs to be a complete trauma expert. And what does that mean? Because I go around the country and say, I deal a lot with trauma, and I would want to know what their training is, what their background is, and how much they understand the neurobiology. Because unless you understand brain chemistry, you don't understand trauma. And this is new. This is new. This science really didn't even, the first paper wasn't even published till 1995. So a lot of my people in this field don't know this, and that's what I'm trying to do is get people familiar with this so that good treatment and diagnosis decisions are made. Does that answer your question? It's very good.
Are we still harming them then in most of those medications that are prescribed because it is burning that into the brain?
Yes, if we're using stimulant medication for an ADHD kid when it's really trauma, we're doing harm. And all we're doing is slowing down how long the brain has to re-regulate. Don't get me wrong, there's still some very resilient brains out there. I mean, there are cases where people have experienced horrendous things and they're still very functional, right? These are not the people you're seeing in your systems, right? But there's very functional people. And the way, you know, here's the example I give on this. So I fly a lot, right? I fly a lot all over the country. And this happens to me all the time, where I'm in those 3-seaters, you know, with 3 people across, and the person in the middle, this just happened, there was this guy who was sick, and he's sneezing, and literally, like, Kleenex or, like, on my legs, and he's like, you know, it was disgusting. Okay, so why would it be that he's in the middle, and the person on the aisle seat, or the window, doesn't get sick, and I do? Because we were exposed to the same stimulus, the same trauma, if you will, right, of this person hacking all over the place. But why? How come that person walked out of the plane and the next week was fine and I wasn't? So maybe I had just got over being sick myself, right? So my immune system's not back and robust as it could be. Maybe I have an autoimmune disorder of some kind, where I'm just kind of compromised generally. Maybe I'm stressed out because I've been on the road for 20 of the last 30 days, and my stress level is quite high. So I'm more susceptible to that. So those are factors to consider, and the person maybe there didn't have any of those factors, doesn't have any of that, so they can be exposed to the same thing, and they're fine. It's the same thing with brain chemistry. Remember to consider historical trauma. This is the piece. How robust, how physically fit is that brain from generations? How much trauma has that person had in their lives? What kind of support system? The one thing we know about trauma that's a protective factor is at least one positive support system in that person's life. So even if it was one uncle or one teacher or one minister or whatever that took an interest in that kid and was a safe, protective, supportive figure, that does a tremendous amount to buffer how badly the brain dysregulates. And I'll show you a slide on that. So, but there's a lot of our kids and families that we know don't have anybody in that role. Sometimes you're it. You're that voice. You're that advocate. So those are the people you're going to see that probably have the most traumatized brains. Any questions before we move on? Okay, so this is the point. This is what's going on in that synapse, y'all. Here's what hormones are in there. Catecholamines, things like epinephrine and neuroepinephrine, right? Corticosteroids, this is heavy-duty stuff like cortisol and glucocorticoids. That's what's in here. It's not good when those things are in here, okay? Opioids, literally opioids. Okay, the body produces things called endogenous opioids that live naturally in the brain, and they only get released under tremendous stress. How many of you are runners? How many's ever experienced that runner's high in a marathon or something like that? Do you? Okay, so that's exactly what happens. You're pushing your body to a level of intensity that, you know, is not quite normal, right? It's not quite normal. It's very different on mile 22 than it is on my little 5K run, right? So the body, under that kind of stress, starts producing the natural opiates that go. And what do you experience when you're, who had that over here, the runner's high? What have you experienced under that, sir?
Oh, I experienced a relaxed state of mind.
Relaxed state of mind, do you feel good?
Yes, and into myself.
Into yourself, you felt great. Do you feel like you would remember a lot of what happened between mile, say,
It's all a blur. I'm trying to get to the finish line now.
okay, look what he said. It's all a blur. It's all a blur. That's what's going on in trauma, y'all. That's what's going on. Memory is impacted. Right here, it says, it prevents pain, inhibits memory consolidation. So people don't remember how bad it felt, right? That's why you do another marathon, right? Because you're like, you don't really remember how bad it was. It's the same thing with childbirth, right? This is why women have kid number 2. Because endogenous opioids get released that, like, it's a euphoric feeling, it's a good feeling, but it inhibits memory consolidation. Literally, memory isn't there. You know, if we asked him, did you remember there was a truck on fire with the hood up? Did you remember seeing that? Most people are like, I don't remember anything, right? That's what happens in trauma. So that's in the synapse. Oxytocin, what does that look like? What's oxytocin look like, the word? Oxycontin. If we put up the chemical, you know, if we were chemists in here and we put up the chemical compound, oxytocin looks exactly almost the same as Oxycontin. It's a narcotic-like substance in the brain. It inhibits memory as well, promotes good feelings. This is also why people can't recall some details with trauma, and they have sometimes very large memory gaps of what they recall. Because look what's in here. We got opiates, oxytocin, powerful, powerful stuff. If we put a prescription bottle and we went here and we smashed this down into pill form and we put that prescription bottle right here, the street value of that stuff would be tremendous. I mean, because look what you got. You got speed. You got this, you know, glucocorticoids, like sugar-like substances. You got narcotics. That's what's going on in a traumatized brain. So that's why it's intense, and the responses are intense. We don't have time to go there, but I do want to go here before our break. So this is a cross-section of the brain. And what I'm concerned about is something down here called the limbic system. This is the limbic system of the brain, which is what's activated under trauma. And you can see that it's what's called low brain. It literally sits right back here, right above the brain stem. Okay? And they call this part of the brain the reptilian brain because it's old. It's about as developed as a reptile's brain. There's not a lot in this part of our brain that's different from lizards, okay? Because it's all about the fear center. They call this the fear center. How do we not be killed, and how do we try to find food so we can survive? It's a survival center of the brain. It's very low. You can see how low it sits. So it's very fast acting. It's just all about fear, fear, fear. Where's safety? Where's safety? You don't kind of get into the planning and strategizing until you get up here to the prefrontal cortex. But look how long, it takes a long time for things to come up the brainstem to get up here as opposed to down here. So the amygdala is this structure right here. It's about as big as an almond. And it's a really intense part of the brain that is always about signaling and finding danger. So trauma, when something traumatizing happens, those people on 9/11 watching the towers, if we had the PET scan, we would see their amygdala going crazy. It would be firing like nobody's business. And the thing about the amygdala is it's not rational. There's no rational thought associated with the amygdala. So imagine, like for example, you have a lot of snakes in Pennsylvania. You have snakes, I figure, okay. So you're hiking and you're on a beautiful trail and you're hiking and all of a sudden like you're going along and then there's a big stick in the trail. But you see that thing and you're convinced it's a snake and your amygdala starts going crazy. It's like fear, 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 snake, and you have this kind of dramatic reaction. You might even gasp. You might step back. You might start running. Those of us who are really afraid might scream, okay? And then those of us who are okay will take a few more steps, and then we look, and we're just like, oh, okay, not moving, stick. And you can see it's slower, and we get into our prefrontal cortex, and we analyze the situation. We're like, okay, this is safe, stick is not going to bite me, right? But it happens so fast, and trauma does the same thing. So you might be working with a kid, you think you're going to be, go up to the kid, form this relationship, and their first response from you is like, not going to trust, back off, have guards up. Because that's the fast response of, is this person safe? Is there danger here? It takes a while to get back into the cortex to really evaluate safety, right? Now here's the thing. Right under the amygdala, there's a structure here called the hippocampus. And it's about as big as a cluster of neurons, half the size of my finger. And this cluster of neurons is responsible for memory. It's like the memory chip in our brain. That is where we store and recall memories. Well, you can see based on location, location, right? This thing, the hippocampus, is right under the amygdala. So when the amygdala is highly activated, it interferes with the functioning of the hippocampus. So what do you think that means? That means that we don't remember and recall things in a narrative, sequential, and chronological way as we would under non-traumatic conditions. So if I asked you, did you have any trauma this morning, sir? No. Okay, thank goodness. So if I said, Judge, what'd you do this morning? Tell me what you did this morning in as much detail as you remember, waking up. Okay. 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 Let me ask you a question. You brushed your teeth. Do you remember what kind of toothpaste you used? What was it? Crest. Okay. Shave, shower. Would you eat breakfast?
Yes, I had a meeting.
Meeting. What'd you have for breakfast? Omelet. What was in the omelet? Perfect. All right. Thank you, Judge. Thanks for sharing the details. Okay. Now, if we had a PET scan on top of Judge right here, we would see his hippocampus like firing real nice. Did you see how he gave? It was very sequential. This, then this. It had good detail. Notice he didn't give some detail, but when I went back and I asked him, what kind of toothpaste, what was in the omelet, he told me. He had it right there. Now, thankfully, Judge didn't have trauma this morning, and his hippocampus was functioning really well. If there was trauma, and this amygdala was going crazy and really scared, if there was a fire in the room and we all evacuated and all our possessions were lost and people were injured, and we asked Judge, what kind of omelet did you have? I mean, he might be able to remember if he really thought about it, but chances are some of that detail would be lost, or he'd skip something that he did this morning because his memory wouldn't be retrievable in exactly the same way. Now, when that happens with trauma survivors, what do we sometimes conclude when parts of the story are left out, or they're not remembered, or they're changed? They're lying. They're making it up. The story isn't consistent. These are sometimes prosecutors' nightmares in these cases because the stories aren't consistent or the stories change. I worked with a sex assault survivor in therapy. Okay, I'm not part of the criminal justice system. I worked with her, and she was the victim of a brutal gang rape that happened in Colorado. And I remember we were in therapy, and it was about session 6 or 7 or so. And she said to me, she had given the initial report to law enforcement, and initially she said it was 3 assailants, and that a knife was also used in the attack. So that was her report to law enforcement. So she's working with me, it's about session number 6, and all of a sudden she comes in and she is just sobbing and she's super upset, and she says, Janine, I have to tell you something. She says, I don't think there was a knife. She said, I think I've been thinking about it and I've been reliving it, and I don't think there was a knife involved. And I think in her brain, she dissociated through a lot of it, and there were gaps, and she was working to fill in the gaps, right? And she said there was a knife, and she was terrified because she knew if then she went back and told law enforcement, actually there wasn't a knife, right, where was that case going to go? It's going to go down the drain real fast. It's like, what else is she making up, right? Did this even happen? Blah, 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 blah. Thankfully, she did go back and clarified it. Thankfully, they did use expert testimony in that case to talk about why memory might change under that kind of horrific threat, and why sometimes details get added or omitted very frequently in those cases. Well, that is because of the hippocampus's relationship to that amygdala. Very, very important to remember. And sometimes victims themselves will blame themselves for not remembering details. And again, the earlier the trauma, particularly when the trauma is pre-verbal, right? People can't even store the memory in the amygdala. Amygdala, and all you have is in the hippocampus. I'm sorry, they can't store it in the hippocampus. So all you have is the amygdala that feels activated under certain conditions, around touch, around safety. Even when they're putting in a foster home that's a good foster home, a kid might still feel escalated and dysregulated because they're not used to that kind of safety, and they don't even know why. And you might not even know why. Does that make sense? Any questions before we break this morning? Okay, so let me tell you, we're going to break, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about the brain, and then things we can do to mitigate this and reverse the dysregulation. Okay. Apologize to Eden. It's your break. Guys, I have to catch a plane, or I got to catch a car to the airport, so I'm going to have to leave very close to noon. I want to leave some time for any questions afterward before I got to scoot out. I also want to apologize. I love the questions, but and for the sake of time, you'll notice I'm skipping some slides. I'm trying to pick what I think are the most important ones. This presentation is usually, ideally, I would like 4 hours. Ideally, I'd like 8. But so some of it is a bit ambitious. And I want to make sure we get to what do we do, right? What do we do? And some real recommendations for court personnel, how this is very applicable in your courtrooms too. Now, before I start, I had a couple questions at break. Where's the woman who just asked me the question just before break, and I said ask it to the big room because it was so good. There you are. You want to go up to the mic?
My question was relating to memory and trauma. And my question was, aren't there times that the trauma actually enhances the memory?
Yes. And here's the thing. So remember I talked about usually in trauma, memory is fragmented, right? It's fragmented memory. But there are some times that people can recall traumatic incidents in a lot of clarity. I testified as an expert witness in this case, and this illustrates that. So this was a woman who was she was actually working with the drug enforcement team and providing information about drug sales, right? And the officer took this woman to this remote part of a certain county that I work in, Colorado, and he proceeded to sexually assault her, right? The agent who was she was informing. And when she told the story, they were asking her, well, where were you? You know, what part of town were you? And she couldn't identify the location. She couldn't really give a good description of much of anything, the cars, the area. But what she recalled was in graphic, vivid detail, this billboard that was outside of the car. as she was being sexually assaulted in the back seat, she kind of focused on this billboard, and she could describe what the ad was for, the colors, what it said in great, great detail. So in that case, her memory actually got laser sharp on one specific detail. And in some ways, that was her way of coping through that, was to really fixate on that and recall that. So in some cases, there can be very, very sharp memory of particular parts of the trauma. That's more the exception than the rule, but it certainly happens. And I think it's because the hippocampus is really firing in, there's less of the opiate and oxytocin-like substances going on there, and it's more that adrenaline and neuroepinephrine, which is causing heightened alert and hyper-responsivity. Does that make sense? I want you to look at this one last thing on the hippocampus. So this slide was taken, this is done out of UCLA, a research out of UCLA. This is an MRI scan. That's what they use. Again, someone else asked, is this measurable? Can you measure what's going on? And the answer now is absolutely yes. And this technology is not that old, though. You know, I mean, functional MRIs are relatively new. And this was taken, this was a group of sexually abused girls, sexually abused young adolescents. I believe they were between about 10 and 14 years old. And they were taken the size of their hippocampus. This was in normal controls. You see the size, and these were the size of the hippocampus in the sexually abused girls. Almost a 12% reduction in hippocampus volume. Okay? So now, for 1 second, think about that. If a memory structure is smaller in sexually abused girls, right? What's that going to mean? It's going to mean memory problems, recall problems, often translating as learning problems. So again, the diagnosis is going to be learning disability. But really, look at that difference in the non-sexually abused girls. And we think here that cortisol is a real problem. And it's cortisol that gets imbalanced in trauma. It's one of the hormones and neurotransmitters that's imbalanced. And look what it does. It does not good things when there's too much cortisol in the body. One of them is shrink the size of the hippocampus. The other thing that I didn't mention earlier that I wanted to talk about is cortisol. That's part of the glucocorticoids, right? When that gets imbalanced, it can also lead to things like autoimmune problems. And what do I mean by like autoimmune? Autoimmune disorders, things like fibromyalgia, Graves' disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, right? All examples of autoimmune. Well, here's the thing, y'all. There is a huge, huge relationship between untreated, unregulated trauma and autoimmune disorders. That's not to say everybody who has an autoimmune had a trauma history, but they live together so closely, and we think it's cortisol that's responsible for that imbalance. Once cortisol gets out of whack in that way, bad things start to happen, and one of them is the autoimmune process. So many sexual assault survivors, particularly, again, if the trauma was early and often, that can manifest in adulthood. So there's a huge link there. I want to talk a little bit about the prefrontal cortex because I talked about the limbic brain. And this is so critical because this is what separates us from the reptiles, right? This is highly developed in humans and primates. And we know that it's the prefrontal cortex that is still developing up till age 24, 25. So what does it do? I like this. You know, it's sometimes talked about it allows executive control over more primitive brain structures. I like to look at it as I like to think that I'm always in control in my prefrontal cortex, but really it's more like executive guidance over things that I do or say. And really what it does, think of the prefrontal cortex as a good, solid braking system on your brain. So when the limbic brain, which is down here, which is what I talked about earlier, that gets so activated in trauma, if there is a strong and robust prefrontal cortex and insula cortex, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Actually, let me go to this slide here, just so this is a visual. So here's the prefrontal cortex right here in this purplish, and this is the insula right here. Again, this is limbic brain down here. See the amygdala, hippocampus? So the insula up here, prefrontal cortex up here. So the stronger the prefrontal cortex and insula is, the more effective it is in providing a braking system for that lower part of the brain. Under trauma, what happens is people go from low brain up. The limbic system rules. But what we want is we want to be ruled from top brain down. And the way to do that is to make sure that those other parts are as robust as they can possibly be. Now here's the challenge in working with kids and adolescents. The cortex, the insula, is not even fully formed. So it can't form as a huge braking system, right? It's not as developed. So you have limbic brain acting a lot, right? Even in non-traumatized kids or teenagers, we know that there's impulsivity and, emotion dysregulation. And then you add trauma onto that without a robust braking system, you can have some issues, right? So the idea is we have to beef this up. So here's the other catch-22. The prefrontal cortex actually shrinks with PTSD. So think about that. You're in a catch-22 because you want to build that up, but again, cortisol is one of the neurotransmitters probably involved in actually shrinking the very thing that can help re-regulate the brain. So what we have to do in treatment is do everything possible to work out the insula and the prefrontal cortex. That is our solution to get the limbic brain less activated. Now, one of the things, let's talk about medication for some medication bad, right? We talked about ADHD medication not being good if ADHD is not the diagnosis. However, sometimes successful SSRI treatment, and SSRIs are serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, right? You've heard of that. Paxil, Prozac, Celexa, Zoloft. We're finding that some short-term, and this is another myth, that trauma survivors have to be on medication for long-term. But short-term, actually, here's the slide right here. It's this one. I don't know where it is in my PowerPoint, but it's this one. You see the increased hippocampal volume on a very short-term dose of Paxil actually increases the hippocampus's neuronal volume by about 35%. That's good. It also shows that short-term SSRI treatment can increase the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. It can actually restore those prefrontal cortex activation patterns. And again, the good news is this does not have to be long-term for life treatment. It can be a way to jumpstart the prefrontal cortex so it starts firing again. Now, how old in kids? I'm not a big fan of putting young kids on medication. But for teenage kids on a simple antidepressant, not a cocktail of medication, there can actually be some benefit to restoring some activation pattern here. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Sorry, I hate to have to skip this, but I want to make sure that we get to what we
Excuse me.
Yeah.
A question.
Sure.
What is short term? You just said a short term.
9 to 12 months.
Thank you.
9 to 12 months. I want to talk a little bit about trauma as it relates to fight and freeze. Because so much of the time we think a trauma response, someone either fights back or they run. And that is very old school thinking. I want you to wipe that from your memory that it's about fight or flight. Because, and as a matter of fact, I think the only reason we're still using that is because it rhymes. Because it's not always accurate. The much more common response in a traumatic situation is freeze. Okay? And we want to understand why that happens, because it's important to understand not only for ourselves, but for the clients we serve, because a lot of times, even when we're talking with little kids or adults, they blame themselves for not acting or doing something different under a traumatic threat. And there's reason that that happens, and it was taught to me by Jakey Cat. So Jakey was my big black and white tuxedo cat, right? No longer on the planet, but he was a good boy. And Jakey was a prolific hunter. He inevitably, when I let him outside, would come back with something, to my dismay, in his mouth, right? So true story, one day I was getting ready for work, and I had let Jakey outside, and he was coming in, the sliding glass door, and I was like, oh no. Because he's standing out there, it looks like something hanging from his mouth, right? This is not good. And he comes in, he's very proud, by the way, he's very proud. He comes walking in, and he comes and he drops the mouse right at my feet. So of course I'm like, borderline mortified, and so I pick Jakey up, and I take him to the bathroom. I just put him in the bathroom while I go get a broom and a dustpan, thinking I'm going into the kitchen to clean up a dead mouse in the middle of my kitchen. But guess what I find when I go in the kitchen? Oh, there's a mouse in there, but it's running so fast around the kitchen, it's no more dead than you and I right now. So that mouse was frozen. The fancy term psychologists use for that is something called tonic immobility, a state of tonic immobility. So my question to you is, why did that mouse freeze? To survive, okay? Because what would have happened if the mouse tried to get away? What would have happened if the mouse would have started, squirming? So Jakey's biting down, right? Internal organ damage, various other bad things, right? Mouse still tries to get away. Jakey's getting the claws involved, right? Now, here's my question to you. Did the mouse strategize that? Was mouse strategizing, oh boy, I'm in Jakey's mouth, and I gotta survive, and I'm gonna use this as a way to get out of this? No, okay? This is an automatic response. So let me tell you why this happens, okay? As part of our brain, we have something called the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is that executive functioning in the brain that controls things in us that we don't think about. Breathing, heart rate, digestion. We don't have to tell ourselves to do this. We do it. There's two branches, if you will, of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. You remember hearing that? These are super important when it comes to trauma. The sympathetic system is the part of the body that gets us ready to react and to respond and to fight back or to react in some way. The parasympathetic system is the part of us that engages when we're relaxed, when we're resting, okay? Right before we go to bed. We're laying in the hammock, right? We're laying around, we're reading a book. We're in parasympathetic activation there. Most of the time, when the parasympathetic system is activated, the sympathetic system is not. They act in accordion to each other, right? But under traumatic stress, and only under traumatic stress, the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system are simultaneously engaged and elevated at the same time. And when that happens, it leads to something called the freeze response. And what that means is that it's adaptive, right? It's adaptive because, like the mouse, in the animal world, if that mouse moves, they're going to get killed. Well, the same happens in the body, but it's not conscious. But it's this idea of freeze. And this is where often, again, in abuse cases, a kid might not do anything or find ways to escape, or someone might submit to a sexual assault. That doesn't necessarily mean they're consenting to it, right? But it's about submission because it's a freeze. It's this is great terror. Automatically, the body goes to that response. It's much more the default. Now, here's the thing, y'all. So this is hard for people to get because what happens is all the blood flow, the energy of the body goes right to the core, right to internal organs. it comes out of the peripheral nervous system. So hands, feet, to kick, to yell, to scream, that's up here, okay? Blood flow goes here. Whoops, but blood flow goes here. So everything collapses here. And in that, sometimes people literally can't scream, yell, kick, anything. But again, we blame sometimes a lot when that happens. Now, I travel around the country and I train a lot of law enforcement officers. And law enforcement sometimes have a hard time with this tonic immobility response. Why didn't he fight back? Why didn't he And as a matter of fact, I was just, oh my goodness. So I live in Colorado, where last summer we had the horrific Aurora movie shooter, right? You follow that in the news. The guy came in during the theater and shot and killed, I think 12 people were killed, 75 injured. So just last week, it was Victims' Rights Week, and they asked me to come to the city of Aurora to talk to the surviving, the victims, surviving victims, to law enforcement who went on the scene. And I went there, and so many of them were feeling a lot of guilt that they didn't do something to stop the shooter. And I remember in the days I was listening to talk radio or some news, and somebody was making the comment of like, well, certainly in the audience there had to be some people who were armed, who were packing a weapon in there. Why didn't they take them down? I don't know about you all, but when I go to the movie theater, first thing I'm doing, I'm sitting, I got my popcorn, I am kicked back, I am in full parasympathetic mode, right? I am not on guard to defend against the shooter who's coming in, through the back door. But yet, look at what our society did. Honestly, the thought was, how come nobody took him down? They invalidate the freeze response, which is so, and again, law enforcement sometimes can struggle with this because law enforcement is trained out of the freeze response, right? Personally, I don't want my law enforcement to be freezing under threat, right? It's a bad thing. But they have training. They're literally trained to override that as threat comes at. As first responders, threat comes at, you're going after threat, right? I'm sorry, that is not me. I would dare say that's not most of us in here, right? And I train with a guy he's actually an Army sergeant investigator, and we train military JAGs and cops all over the country. And he was telling me a story about Fort Hood, Texas. Do you remember that, where the psychiatrist actually came into a health clinic and opened fire to military personnel, military-trained personnel who were waiting for their physical exams, right? Getting their blood pressure or whatever checked. And he did actually the post-incident investigation in that, and he found of the, I believe it was 11 or 12 people that were killed, all but one of them were shot seated in their seat where they were waiting. Because these military personnel, no matter how the training, when you're sitting waiting to get your blood pressure checked, you're reading, People magazine or whatever you're reading in the thing, your sympathetic system is not active. It's not ready to respond to threat. And these are all dramatic examples, but just think about kids in their homes where it should supposedly be safe, where the guard should be down, and then they're groomed or assaulted by people they know. Their instinct isn't going to necessarily be to fight or run out of that situation. It's going to be freeze. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So hopefully you'll remember Jakey and that freeze response and understanding that and watching how we blame or we question when people don't respond. It happens all the time. Happens all the time. So, if you don't remember anything from what we talked about today before we go into kind of some of the treatment, remember this. The more a neural system is activated, the more it will change. What fires together wires together. Trauma leads to dysregulation of both the autonomic nervous system and the limbic system, right? And often memory is corrupted by the trauma. The recall could be impaired, and the past feels like it's present neurobiologically. So let's talk about Well, we should talk a little bit about how this impacts us and how we exhibit our own response, right, to the trauma we see. Because like I said, our brains are no more different than the victims we're serving. And what are our triggers, you know, and how are we managing that? We can be in big denial around this. And here's some just examples. Notice about how this plays out for you. Do you feel very emotional during, after a session or a meeting or a particular hearing? Right? Difficulty sleeping, nightmares, a vivid replaying of the client's trauma. You know, revenge fantasies. Wanting to get back at someone. A loss of interest in sex or romance or being close to other people. And then our own numbing and flat affect, a loss of sense of humor or warmth. This is how it shows up in us. And this, I want to be very clear, this is very different than burnout. Sometimes this is like gets confused to I'm burnt out. Burnout is usually about dealing with work demands. Like there's too many demands. There's too many things I got to get done in a short period of time. Like I'm overloaded on my job. That's burnout. If that's too chronic and too long, you just feel like you don't have what it takes to meet the demands of the job, or the job's unreasonable in that way. That's burnout. Vicarious trauma is very different. It's that feeling of being emotionally impacted by the work. And I will tell you right now, we want to go into denial around this. We want to go into big, fat denial because we like the work we do. And since we're very good at it, we want to keep that up. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. It's to pay attention. So everything I'm about to tell you that our clients need to do, we need to do. Okay? So I'll go to that. Oh, wait, here's more. Here's more. Generalized anxiety, worry, overwhelm, incompetence, you know, pervasive cynicism. I see this in law enforcement a lot. They disguise it as dark humor or back humor. I've never worked with a more traumatized group than law enforcement. Hardest job in the world, in my opinion, in some ways. Tendency to talk more about our own trauma history. And this is a biggie. Seeing others as potential abusers or victims. I think this is real common. You know, we go into this kind of because we want to try to feel safe. So, let's see. Gosh, I want to go here. So, strategies that address neurobiological issues. I feel like when I give this presentation, sometimes it feels like I take you down this road of like, oh my gosh, our brains are all messed up and all the people we work with and what do we do? And there's no way to change it. Well, there are ways to change it, okay? And some of it, my guess is some of it you're already doing, and some of it we're not. Okay, so here's what to do. Bruce Perry is a psychologist who works a lot in child maltreatment. And he says there's no more effective neurobiological intervention than a safe relationship. So why? I mean, I think about the guardian ad litems in the room or other people who are working directly with families who are traumatized or kids. What are you doing? First, if you're providing safety with boundaries, with care, with nurturing, you may not know it, but what you're doing is you're helping people rebalance oxytocin and vasopressin. Both are hormones that are linked to bonding and characterized by strong attachment. You're helping put that into the brain. You have kids who have had horrible neglect, who have not been mirrored in a way, either physically or emotionally, where they're cared about or their experience matters. By the way, neglect is underrated in the profound neurobiological pieces that it causes. And in my opinion, in doing the treatment, I have seen some of the worst PTSD under neglect than I have under either physical or sexual abuse. It's profound. This is one reason, because they don't get the strong attachments that are characterized in relationships. So if you are given that child, that teenager, that parent, you're actually, rewiring the orbitofrontal cortex in the limbic system to mediate emotional response and balance back the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Because again, Trauma dysregulates brain functioning. And if somebody dysregulates into a freeze response, which I just explained, which is the simultaneous engagement of sympathetic and parasympathetic, well, guess what? Sometimes people stay in a freeze response. They can stay there. And what does that mean? What does that look like? That could look like they don't follow through on your treatment plan. That could mean like they don't follow through on therapy, or they don't even think they need it, right? That could look like they're not doing what they need to do for the kids. That's freeze response. So what you want to do is try to train the brain that it's safe enough to get out of that freeze response. You're like, well, how the heck do I do that? There's no magic button except to say, give a positive relationship where it's safe and accepting, and over time, that will rewire things. And you might think, how many of you have worked with a family or a particular kid and you think, I'm not doing any good. I'm not getting anywhere. There's no good. I feel like I'm making it worse, or certainly I'm not helping. You have to know that if you're doing this, you're actually helping. You also have to know that you can't reverse years of trauma if a neural system has been so activated and changed. You know, it's not going to change in 6 weeks or 6 months. But you can start the process of that rewiring right here. The importance of empowerment. This is huge. Every time you make a decision, every time the kids you work with make a decision, when they're involved in their treatment about court or child welfare decisions, if they're involved, when they make a decision, it develops the cortex. So it's a way of working out that lifting weights on that prefrontal cortex. And the one thing you want to avoid is avoid using relationships as consequences, okay? Particularly if they're positive relationships, restricting family visits or peer connections, right? This is if there's not active abuse. But let's say, you know, you're working with Sammy and Juan is Sammy's best friend. The last thing, and Juan's a good kid and a positive influence on Sammy, the last thing you want to do is take away Juan. Because that presence of Juan will do more to rebalance Sammy's brain than any kind of therapy that we could possibly do. So we have to find where their positive connections are and reinforce those and allow those to stay. And consider those things too when we're making changes and moving from family to family or foster home to foster home. How are we doing that? Right? How are we doing that can maintain some of those positive connections, because that's where the healing is. Sometimes it's inevitable decisions, but you got to be mindful about how to create these, because that's what will heal. I talked a little bit, that was my side about hippocampus. And I talked about ADHD. Okay. Engaging and exercising the brain. Look at this. Remember I talked about the prefrontal cortex? Look at this guy on the left. He's at a class. He looks kind of bored and irritated. He's not taking any notes. And look at his brain. It's like a couch potato, okay? He's not working it out. Whereas this guy, he's taking notes, he looks alert, he's sitting up, and he's working out his brain. The importance of learning new things in that prefrontal cortex is huge. So with kids and families that you work with, one of the best interventions that can be done is encouraging them to learn new content, new skills, new games, new activities. Because what you're doing is you're building new neural connections that aren't traumatized. It's neurocorrective, okay? You're beefing up your brain in a way moving forward. So you might walk out of here. Here's the thing, y'all. You might walk out of here for lunch and you might feel better. And it doesn't have anything to do about me. It has to do with you and your brain's work today. You worked out. You're the guy on the right. You worked out. Things came together for you in a new way. You learned something. You might find that you might be less irritable, that you might be more focused because you developed this right here. It's the same for our kids and our families. How many of, we do the same thing. We drive home from work the same way, or we shop in the same grocery store. How many of you shop in the same grocery store? I go to the same one, like all the time. I have my routine, right? Try shopping at a different grocery store. Although don't do this under stress. I mean, don't do this like if you have 10 minutes. Because it's stressful, you know? Because you have to think, you have to use your brain. Because I know in my grocery store exactly where the cucumbers are and the almond milk and the, you know, I know exactly where to go. When I have to stop and I can't go on automatic, I'm beefing my brain. It sounds ridiculous, but it's actually profound. One of the best things you can do for kids, find something they're interested, guitar, quilting, whatever it is, and have them learn that skill. Because that's going to provide a break for that limbic system that's probably running wild in trauma. Okay, this is not rocket science, and you don't need a Ph.D. behind your name to do these interventions, and they work better than a lot of traditional talk therapy. This is, oh gosh, I don't have time. Sorry, I wish I could do. Okay, this is just a way for you to meet all my animals, right? But this is Scout, and Scout is awesome. This is where we hike in Crested Butte, and the cool thing of what we know about trauma is that touch is a really important phenomena because it rewires things like cortisol in the brain. You know, I don't like to, it's hilarious because I fly all over the country and I hate it. I don't like to fly. So I have been known, I am that weird person that has been known in turbulence to like say, can I hold your hand to the person, like complete stranger next to me. It's quite embarrassing. It's very humbling. And, but that is not purely a psychological phenomenon. I mean, some of it that somehow, you know, the guy next to me is going to save me on those bumps. But the other piece is touch. The simple act of touch rebalances cortisol. Touch. Now, here's the thing. For kids or adults who have been traumatized, trust is not an easy thing. I mean, touch is not an easy thing. It's complicated. So what we're finding is it doesn't even have to be with a human. So petting Scout or loving on the cat or the hamster is a way to rebalance cortisol and get that horrible stress chemical re-regulated. It also balances things like lowers blood pressure, triglyceride levels, all the things that get thrown out when cortisol is so imbalanced. So really practically, you know, using dogs in court. I don't know if any of the Pennsylvania courts allow dogs, and you all do. I mean, it's not just a feel-good thing because I'm a dog lover and I want Scout with me at work. It's about neurobiological re-regulation in the court system. And it's not a warm, fuzzy thing. It's like that has no benefit. It has scientific knowledge behind it that it's a good thing. So I could talk a lot about this, but there's 3 things that we have found out that thicken the cortex and beef up the insular cortex. And those 3 things are meditation, mindfulness, and yoga practice. And if you think this sounds like woohoo, you know, you have to be this meditator like this guy sitting on the thing, you know, at the Buddhist temple or something, you don't. Elizabeth Lazar is probably the person who has done the most research on this, and this is a study she did. She took Boston area construction workers, Boston area construction workers, and she taught them to meditate up to 40 minutes a day. 40 minutes is a lot. You know, it's actually shown that you can get the same effect starting at 5. And she taught them how to, and then she measured their cortexes, and she found the cortex volume up to 40% thicker in meditators than non-meditators. That's huge, because that means that controls that response. And I want you to think, I'm looking for something, because I'm going to do an exercise. Is this somebody's coffee? Let's see. They're not here. Okay, because I'm going to do an exercise. Will you come with me? Rick, okay, come to the microphone. I want you to think also, meditation doesn't have to look like sitting on the pillow in lotus position. I mean, it's nice, but there's ways to do it. So this is a little technique. This is taken from a technique in dialectical behavioral therapy called DBT. This is a technique called observe and describe. So Rick, let's say Rick's, you know, a 10-year-old kid. He's kind of acting a little crazy. I need to kind of re-regulate him. So Rick, in as much detail as you can, describe for me what you see.
There's 2 leaves and a reduce, and it's a coffee cup. It's got a black top, and there's stuff written on it. There's a little star that's silver. There's RC cup. I can't read without my reading glasses. There's a map of the world, at least the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, good. Take another look and just see if you see anything else, or if you can describe anything else about the cup.
It contains 25 somethings. It's round. It's about 5 inches high. It's got white borders at the top and the bottom.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, thank you for being a volunteer. That's all you had to do. Okay, now, you're like, what the heck was that? What we just did on a coffee cup that I just pilfered from somebody's table, that's called an observe, describe experiment. That's an example of a 30-second meditation mindfulness practice. You're like, what? How? Now, some of you couldn't see Rick's face, but I could. If you saw him, were you anywhere else than where you were in that 30 seconds? So, did you hear what he said? Absolutely not. I was focused. And all I did on whatever's available was had him focus on that and observe it and describe it. If you could see his face, his eyes are right there, his demeanor is calm. If we would have had him hooked up, we would have seen parasympathetic activation. We would have seen rebalancing going on in his brain like crazy. That took 30 seconds. Right like that, you're going to have someone balanced. If you can get, and kids, the thing about kids, they love that kind of stuff. They're so naturally engaged in that. That's a mindfulness meditation practice. It's easy. That's the kind of stuff not only should our clients do, we should do. Okay, this is full self-disclosure in Pennsylvania. I've already disclosed my fear of flying. I'm going to disclose my other quirky thing. So I love birds. Okay, I'm a birder. Like, I'll be the ones that has the vest with the hat and like getting the bird chips or whatever you get. I love birds. So a couple years ago, I took this vacation to Costa Rica. And I came back from this vacation. It was like 10 days. I was birding the whole time. Costa Rica is phenomenal for birds, right? And I came back from this vacation, and I realized I was like so chill, and I was like so like refreshed. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I went on vacation. But I realized that what I was doing for 10 days is I was engaged in a mindfulness practice. Because all I did every morning, I didn't have TV, I didn't have paper, I didn't have anything. I would get up, and I would look for and watch birds. And I realized that what I was doing was completely, I didn't go on a meditation retreat, you know? But what I was doing was so mindful that I realized I came back with a changed brain in a way that I wouldn't if I have gone to Mexico or if I've gone to New York City for the week, right? It was different. It was profoundly different. And I realized that that's what that was. It was mindfulness practice. So those are the types of things we want to do. I could talk, sir. Sure? Yes, you can.
Well, how would you describe them from a practice standpoint for us? The sort of activities that would be meditation like? We're working with somebody. It's coloring, drawing.
Yes. So what are mindfulness? Anything that puts somebody in the moment. So coloring and drawing is incredible because it does a lot of things. It also activates the right hemisphere. Right, it gets somebody out of left hemisphere into right. It's very tactile. So coloring or drawing is good. There's also a website called Brain Gym. Have you all heard of a website called Brain Gym? It gives activities that are also mindfulness in the moment. BrainGym.com. Anything observe and describe, pictures, taking pictures, drawing pictures, all of that. Anybody else? Anything that you've used? Okay, that's good. Great question. I honestly could probably spend an hour talking about yoga and what yoga has done with trauma. Let me start out by saying, all the trauma experts in Boston that's coming out of the trauma center, a man by the name of Bessel van der Kolk, who really is behind the neurobiology of trauma, his center isn't doing any treatment, no treatment, without incorporating yoga into treatment. My Rape Crisis Center in Boulder, Colorado that I oversee, we have done away with traditional talk therapy alone. It has to incorporate elements of yoga in the treatment. Kids particularly love this. This is an easy sell with kids. It's a little harder with adults. So why? You're like, why? What's so special about yoga? Physical activity in general is huge, right? But yoga does something a little bit different, and it's related to something called HRV, heart rate variability. And what yoga does, anybody practice yoga in here? Anybody yoga practitioners? A few? What yoga does is in the practice, you go from one pose or a sequence of poses where your heart rate is really high, like running or other aerobics. Your heart rate gets really high. But a good teacher will sequence the class so that at the very next pose you do, you're actually bringing your heart rate down. Okay, and that's what you do for an hour and 15 minutes. You go from high heart rate to low heart rate, high heart rate to low. It increases this thing called HRV, which is an indication of the body's ability to respond more flexibly to stress. So then when a stressor comes up or something really stressful or intense, your body doesn't then escalate, and freak out to that triggered, amplified state. It can automatically, without conscious, kind of kick into a more relaxed place where there's less reactivity in the physiology. And it's literally transformational, right? It also shows yoga is all about breathing, right? It's all, you know, if you don't breathe, it's just like doing step aerobics. What makes yoga is you breathe in, breathe out consciously. That breathing mimics the parasympathetic's response to things like ECT, right? Shock therapy, or taking an antidepressant. It has that same effect. The outcomes are off the chart. If there was a psychotherapeutic model that had the outcomes of yoga, we'd be using it every day. And again, I'm not completely dissing talk therapy. It has its place, and it's important for some of the cognitive restructuring that happens in trauma. But this is what will re-regulate the brain. Okay. Let's scout again. The importance of exercise, right? To talk about rebalancing melatonin, enhancing sleep, releasing endorphins. That's another good way to release those endogenous opioids, right? And then sleep. You know, when somebody is not sleeping, this doesn't sound like a sexy intervention, but when somebody is not sleeping, the system stays on high alert. Excuse me. Serotonin and dopamine don't get a chance to refresh and rebalance. Your synapses don't reset. And sometimes it can even be done under just resting, right? When we activate our parasympathetic. But how many of you, I can't imagine, how many of you really rest in any given day? I mean, there'll be times I come home and I sit on the couch and it's 9 o'clock and I realize this is the first time I've sat all day. It's the first time I breathed. It's the first time I have rested with electronics off. Right? And unless we do that, all we're doing is keeping cortisol elevated, and we're not getting this is why we get sick. This is why we have weight issues. This is because cortisol is never reset in a restful way. Huge, huge. And then finally, the importance of diet. The brain reads a drop in blood sugar as danger, and someone who has a trauma response is going to read that as danger, right? It could result particularly in kids, mood swings, panic, anger, because the blood sugar is going up and down. And what do? What do we go for when we're stressed? What have a lot of our clients feeding kids? It's caffeine, sugar, right? Nicotine, candy, soda. All of us do it. All of us do it. Well, we got to know that that is doing nothing to rebalance our brain chemistry. Nothing. Even some fruit that we think is good is high in sugar. Now, again, that's not saying don't eat this. We should never eat it. I mean, I'll be the first one to grab the chocolate chip cookie. It's just to know that when we're dysregulated and on edge, or we're working with kids or families who are already so traumatized, this in no way is going to help it. And what do? We sit down. Somebody comes to the office. First thing, you want a cup of coffee. Or there's donuts in the waiting room. It's the worst thing we can do. We need to be doing things like berries, which have high fiber, low sugar, regulate blood sugar levels. Lean proteins and carbs, right? Turkey sandwich, salmon salad, tofu stir fry. This is what's going to eat to re-regulate our brain. So huge, huge amount of diet intervention. Now I'm going to leave you, got 10 minutes left, with some real strategies that tie together what we talk about for what else you can use, okay? First of all, we talked about safety and the need to have a safe, welcoming environment. Well, these are great examples of a child and family environment. Right here, Pennsylvania courtrooms, right? Being creative in the physical environment. So it looks like Bucks County. Where's Bucks County? That's you all. Is that Amish country? No. Quaker. All right, I'm thinking Lancaster. Okay, got it. So, I mean, I talked about allowing dogs in the courtroom and that not being just a, touchy-feely thing. The whole thing about decreasing fear of the unknown in the courtroom, what the brain likes is to be prepared. It likes to know what's coming, particularly when it's a traumatized brain. So the more that there's the fear of the unknown, right? And, I added this last thing, being aware of proxemics and boundaries in courtrooms. So I was in Kansas. I was just in Kansas. And I was talking to this man whose daughter was murdered in a domestic violence case. And he had to go give a victim impact statement. And it was a horrible case. And the way the courtroom was set up was that he was here reading, and the defendant was probably about where you are in the red. And the victim advocate and the court people were working to try to move that, to either move the defendant or move the father, right? Because the father was like, I think I'm going to jump and attack him, And it was so triggering because he was so close. And they made many motions, and the judge just refused to make that change. Not recognizing the level of trauma in that father and how just that proxemics of being that close to that defendant activated him so badly. And he wasn't even able to really get through his whole victim impact statement because just that proxemics was so triggering to him, he couldn't focus. So that was not necessarily a trauma-informed courtroom. I think that, and particularly after it was on sentencing when the victim impact statement was read. Assure, this is probably your biggest system strategy, and I got a lot of questions over the break. It's like, how do I do this? How do I assure that all professionals are trained in trauma and understand it? Those are longer questions, right? And I'm happy to help in whatever way I can, but you want to make sure that the people that you're sending to therapy know at least cognitive, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. They're using evidence-based practices that work, and they're supplementing with things like that I talked about, using exercise, yoga, diet, sleep, other kinds of learning to supplement the treatment, particularly in kids. Otherwise, you're going to get 25% of a healing outcome. Okay? Recognize what gaps you have in your services, right? In your continuum, in your team. Sandy, is there a chance for them to do that later today? Awesome. So you'll be able to recognize those gaps. Again, I think some of that for kids in particular is kids want to know what's coming. Ensure that the child is prepared. Give them a voice. Give them choice. And focus on strength. In trauma, so much we focus again on what's wrong. What's wrong with kids? What's wrong with them? And instead, we want to ask what happened and what's right. Okay? And then setting the tone for parents and working with parents, encouraging the parents to bring support people to court. That's huge. They need their own trauma regulation too. Reducing the fear of the unknown and addressing the trauma in parents. I feel like we talked about that today. And then for you all, making sure that you're paying attention to your own vicarious trauma, not dismissing it as burnout, not thinking that a week vacation once a year will refresh you in the way. It's got to be habits that you institute yourself on a daily basis. It's so old school that we can work, 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 and take a week vacation and feel better. It's more about how every day are we activating our parasympathetic systems. And I'm gonna ask you, how have you activated your parasympathetic system today? You know, how are you willing to turn off your cell phone and your laptop an hour at least before you go to bed every night, and have an hour without electronics, where you're connecting, where you're finding support, where you're eating, where you're exercising, and having some kind of meditative mindfulness prayer or practice? It's critical for that rebalancing. That's a lot of information. A couple things I want to end on. So I do have to get a car to the airport, but I think I have about 15 minutes. So are there any questions we can ask in the big group, and then I can be available? Let's take a few now. Sir, and come to the microphones, if you will, so everybody can hear.
You talked about the relationships, how important they are for traumatized individuals. It doesn't seem to work with children with RAD. Could you give us any suggestions about that?
Boy, RAD is the acronym for reactive attachment disorder. And I really honestly don't feel that's within my bounds of expertise to talk about. It's a very specific diagnosis, it's a specific treatment, and I feel like that would go out of the bounds of what I feel like my expertise is. Other than to know it's a traumatized response for sure, but I don't feel like I would be within my bounds to answer that. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned EMDR treatment earlier, and I was at a presentation months ago where they said that doesn't work. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the dichotomy between, us wanting to do empirically based practices versus other type of practices that can be helpful for the individuals, but yet maybe there isn't good statistical data?
Well, I'm concerned about where you heard that EMDR doesn't work, because I will share what I know of the research. With EMDR is one of the most researched evidence-based practices out there, and the outcomes are very solid with both kids and adults. So I think EMDR is very good for symptom reduction of trauma. You know what I mean by symptom reduction? Where there is hyperarousal, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks of the event, that type of intrusion, EMDR is actually quite good. Because what it does, by the way, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what it does is it works, the premise is you do things like this, tapping on either side, or sometimes they'll have you watch fingers go back and forth, or light pulsations, okay? And you're like, what the heck is that? That is an effort to bilaterally stimulate the brain. It's bilateral stimulation, meaning left hemisphere, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. You're like, how's that? Why does that work? This makes no sense. What we think of how that works is that, remember how I talked about trauma lives in the amygdala, in the fear center? Do you remember that? EMDR, when you bilaterally stimulate the brain, it starts moving the traumatized memory out of the amygdala and back into the hippocampus and integrates into the prefrontal cortex. It actually helps the memory move. It's not like people forget what happened to them. It's not like the memory goes away. It just doesn't live in the fear center anymore. So it's not as charged emotionally. Someone can recall an event after having EMDR in a more regulated way. And here's the thing, y'all. By the way, EMDR, guess how EMDR was founded? Walking. Walking. Because when I walk, I am going left, right, left, right. I'm bilaterally stimulating my brain. So let me tell you something. Okay. After September 11th, right? September 11th happened, and they sent all these psychologists down to lower Manhattan, right, to study what they thought was going to be a lot of PTSD in lower Manhattan. So we get down there, and what did we find? We didn't find a whole lot of PTSD, except for the first responders, the people who went, responded to the scene. But a lot of the people who witnessed the towers, they weren't traumatized. So why do you think that is? How many of you have been to lower Manhattan? You know what happens when there's no trains and no subways? And how are you going to get out of that city? You walk. You remember those pictures of people going over like the Brooklyn Bridge and right? So they were walking. And my guess was, an assumption, is that they were also talking, right? And processing what they saw, what they heard as they're moving out. And, did that cure them? No. Were their symptoms less? They were very much less. Contrast that with something like Katrina. What happened in Katrina?
They got stuck.
You see the images, people were stuck on roofs, okay? Plus, I think there were some other socio-political reasons there that, in terms of the, response and the delay and whatnot for getting to people. But I think that, that's the trauma in post-Katrina was enormous. And I think it was because, and then what do, y'all? What do? When we get a traumatized victim that comes to seek services for us, here's what we do. Come to my office. This is the worst thing that you can do for somebody who's experienced a trauma. And this is what we do. This is what we do. Because there's no working through and moving through anything. We have them come in our office and we give them a cup of coffee, right? Make that worse. And then we have them sit, right? It's the worst thing we can do for victims in our system. I went to Kansas. I said, you know what? Nobody sit with victims. Get up. Maybe you walk. You walk through the courtroom. The importance of judges allowing breaks in courtrooms to allow breaks to move things a little bit so things aren't just sitting there is a way to re-regulate. I'm going off. I just went off. The question was EMDR. Okay. Hopefully that's helpful. Yes, ma'am.
As a purchaser of services for our kids, what qualifications should we be looking for someone who's trauma-informed?
Yeah, I care so much less about degree, right? I mean, I don't, Ph.D. doesn't mean anything. I mean, I want somebody who is trained in trauma-informed care. I want to know what training they're having in trauma-informed care, trauma-focused CBT. I want to know what their knowledge is of the neurobiology of trauma and what I explained today. And some of that, I don't know, in Colorado, you can practice with a BA. I don't know. I don't care. To me, licensed PhDs, it doesn't matter. I want to know if you're trained in those specific modalities. Yep.
When it comes to talking to the children about their trauma, if a child is staying with foster parents and the child wants to open up and talk to the foster parent about it, but the foster parent is not trained in dealing with trauma, should that parent talk to the child about it or not?
I think one of the things we know is a safe connection. If the child is now, this is if the child is initiating the contact, right? That's very different than if the foster parents tell me what's going on. The child has to decide when and with whom is safe, right? But absolutely, if that foster parent, that's the myth. Like, we don't have to have all the right answers. All we have to do is validate, believe, and support. If we can do that, that will in and of itself be an effective intervention. So, and if that kid feels safe enough to pursue that absolutely, I think that's something that I would encourage. Now, if that happens, we can't underestimate then the bond that kid is going to feel with that foster parent. So if we have to make changes in the system, right, if they get moved, whatever happens, we have to know that that's a pretty significant attachment, and how can we work with that and or find ways to, continue that attachment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great question. So I have to tell you, it's been my pleasure. It has been a true pleasure. I'll be around for a little bit, but Thank you. This is a heavy topic, so thank you for your attention and your participation, and it's been an honor. Thank you for your work. Appreciate it.